Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here on a short, brief episode of Veracity Hill, where we're striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. I'm here in Charlotte, North Carolina at the SES National Conference on Christian Apologetics. And just joining me for a little bit is a historian, New Testament scholar, Christian philosopher, and apologist, Gary Habermas. Gary, great to have you on our program today.
Glad to be with you.
Thanks for squeezing us in here.
That's literally what it is, isn't it?
There are so many people here. It's great. Everyone's showing up at your table. They want to talk with you, encourage you, and get your John Hancock on those books.
Yeah,
so,
I guess.
Now, you've written a number of books on the historical Jesus.
Right.
And one of the arguments that you bring in your presentations and your research is what you call the minimal facts argument.
Right.
It may, in fact, be, although we've done our podcast now for 2 years, that we haven't had a chance to talk about the minimal facts argument. Could you just briefly lay out what that is?
Sure. It occurred to me when I was doing my doctoral dissertation that, well, let me back up. When I had the topic approved, which was the resurrection, the head of my dissertation committee said, who didn't believe like I did, he said, we don't mind you using the New Testament, but don't say something happened because the New Testament said it happened. You have to be critical, and you have to use critical sources, and that'll be worth it. He said, we don't have to agree with you, but you have to be able to defend it, your thesis, critically. So that got me thinking, what would it take to make a critically ascertainable thesis, dissertation, on the topic of the resurrection of Jesus? So the argument basically is, plus I should tell you too, I went through over 10 years of doubts on it, so I thought to myself, golly, this is going to help me a lot too. So basically the argument says, I can take the basic data that virtually any New Testament scholar, now the only catch is, I don't care how far to the left or right they are. They just have to be a scholar. They have to know the territory. So you have to be a theologian or a philosopher or a historian or a classicist or a New Testament scholar, And they have to know how you get facts, how you tell them. They have to be able to operate in the field of history. And once they did that, I worked on it for a long time, but I worked on a list of facts, and my thesis is you can use a short list of facts. I go anywhere from 3 to 8 probably over the years. Presently I'm using 6. And I'm getting ready to defend them in just a few minutes in the lecture here, but I'm giving a list of over 60 historical evidences critically ascertained for these 6 facts, which is an average of about 10 apiece.
So while these supervisors of yours said you have to use critical sources, we could recognize that they have certain biases against the Gospels.
Sure.
For you, though, you thought from a functional perspective, what would it take?
I want to use the right word here. I didn't concede their point of view, but I worked with it.
Yeah.
So that I was producing things. Well, hey, listen, they didn't make me add anything to the dissertation.
So that's great. You said, well, you didn't concede. You wanted to see how to work with their position to get them over to...
Which is how, and not so much like to quote-unquote convert them. I was trying to do a good research dissertation, and I guess one way to do a good dissertation is a one-size-fits-all. Something that anybody who knows how to do research would use this because it fits everybody's criteria. If it fits the left's, if it fits an atheist New Testament scholar or a Jewish New Testament scholar, the conservatives aren't going to kick over in the right.
So tell us, what are some of these facts that you've used? You said 3 to 8.
Yeah, if I were to use 6, and I can get through them pretty quickly. Jesus died by crucifixion. I mean, just basically, I just got done writing this. John Dominic Crossan says in his book, Who Killed Jesus?, co-founder of the Jesus Seminar, Crossan says the fact that Jesus died by crucifixion is as well established as any historical fact can possibly be.
Wow.
That's pretty close to a quote.
Yeah.
Bart Ehrman gives 15 independent sources for the resurrection, for the death of Jesus within 100 years of the event. And another one I cited, there was Garrett Ludeman, the atheist, at least I've heard him called an atheist, New Testament scholar, who says the death of Jesus by crucifixion is, his word, indisputable. All right, so you say, well, that's not an argument. A lot of people die. Right, but he has to be dead before he rises, so I had to start there. Secondly, and I'm real picky about the word in here, Jesus' disciples reported having experiences, real experiences, that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. They interpreted their experiences. They thought their appearances of the risen Jesus. Thirdly, this teaching was taught, this teaching was proclaimed very, very early. The consensus, the New Testament consensus today, even on the left, quite a bit over, Bart Ehrman says there's several sources that proclaim this within 1 to 2 years after the cross. That's Bart Ehrman. And if you want to go 5, which would have put Paul in Jerusalem interviewing Peter and James, as Paul Barnett, the Australian historian, says, there's nothing like this in the ancient world in historiography, to have sources that
close to the timing of the event.
And to only be the center of Christianity, and only to be, if you have this, you have everything, basically, 1 Corinthians 15.
Yeah.
Okay, number 4, they turned the world upside down with this message. And I say, and people are waiting, there's critics who are waiting for me to say, and they died at martyrs' death. We can't prove all of them died, not with early sources, not with these same historiographical principles we're talking about, but you can prove they were all willing to die for it. You go, well, how do you know what's in their mind? I don't have to know what's in their mind. Just look how often they put themselves in harm's way. Paul is stoned once, he's shipwrecked 3 times, and he doesn't quit. He is beaten 40-1 3 times, any of those he could have died from, and he keeps right on doing it. I'm furthering the kingdom of God. I want people to come into the kingdom. I wish others could come and I would be lost. So there's a person who puts himself in harm's way. John tells a story in John 21. He claims that Jesus said to Peter, the time's going to come when you're going to be an old man and people are going to take you where you don't want to go. And it says, this Jesus said to foretell the death he would die for Jesus Christ. So putting themselves, I'm not arguing about the martyrdoms, although 3 of the 4 biggest names, Peter, Paul, and James, the brother of Jesus, we have first century data for their martyrdom. So they put themselves in harm's way and were very willing to, as Acts 4 says, for people like Acts 4, they went out after they were beaten, and they went out rejoicing that they could suffer for his name, and they went out, Acts 4:33, proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus. So it was the center. That's an additional fact I could throw in. That would be number 7. But it's a center of faith very early, and they were transformed by it. Then 2 skeptics I separated because there were different cases. Paul and James, the brother of Jesus, are both skeptics who came from different backgrounds for different reasons. Paul, of course, basically a PhD in Old Testament, and James, a household member.
Yeah.
So they both bring different kinds of skepticism to the table. They both end up as, 2 of the 4, along with Peter and John, the 4 big names in the early church.
So maybe for the disciples, though, maybe not Paul or James, someone might posit, say there was a mass hallucination. Right?
Yeah.
Maybe you said they perceived to have this experience. Maybe they were all just fooling themselves.
Yeah, then the problem with mass hallucinations, the best evidence comes from 1 Corinthians 15:3-7, which the consensus position is that goes back, it's one of those texts from 1 to 2, almost everybody says, there are exceptions, but
the creed.
Almost everybody says it goes 1 to 2 years after the cross, and that early creed lists 3 group hallucinations. And if that's what they're going to say, group hallucinations. I know of a medical doctor and a clinical psychologist who both did lit reviews of how many, not just hearsay, how many known cases of group hallucinations are there in the medical literature, in the psych literature. Not a single case. Now, even if somebody did say to me, well, hey, I haven't closed all the loops, but I've got one that looks like it's pretty close, I'd say, you know something? You can't hardly prove one in history, and there's 3 of them back to back to back, so you're going to tell me the only 3 times this happened to Jesus? I'm sorry. That's just too close to resurrection. Especially when all the data say it was resurrection.
So what sort of feedback do you get against the minimal facts argument?
Not much. Even critics. I debated one very well-known New Testament scholar. I won't give his name right now, just so as not to reopen the debate. But this has happened many times, so you could find it in several guys. We started with the data and put it on the table. And so, what do you think? This guy was an agnostic, and very well known. And we put it on the table, and the guy goes, "You can have all 6. They're good." He said, "In fact, they're probably the strongest facts in the New Testament. So fire away. What do you want to say about them?" That's how we started the dialogue. First 10 minutes.
Wow. So maybe someone would just say, well, this is just made up. They just made the content up.
Yeah, but you got the guys willing to die for made-up content. And the problem with made-up content objection is that you have to get it to the disciples or it's worthless. If it's not the disciples who made it up, you're not answering their experiences. And by the way, if it's made up, this isn't one of my 6 because, well, there's a criterion I have that's not terribly objective, but I think it's valuable, and that is how many critics are involved. 90-something% allow these 6, but the empty tomb is right behind it at about 75, and the empty tomb says something physical happened. If you think the Shroud of Turin is Jesus's, which is a little behind that maybe, but the Shroud says something physical happened. So you can't just say somebody cooked this thing up and said, why don't we just say he was, yeah, this isn't cut it. And critics, by the way, will almost never go there.
Okay, how about, last question here. What about the claim that we just can't know what happened to Jesus? Maybe someone who wants to remain agnostic.
That's fine. That's absolutely fine. First of all knowledge, all inductive knowledge is probabilistic. That's the nature of induction, no matter what it is. And so I'm satisfied with the probable argument. If they're an unbeliever, and they're going to rest eternity on this, I think they'd want to be better off than saying, I have an improbable argument. I'm happy with that. Okay, great. But if they walk away from me, a guy last night came and talked to me, an atheist, and he said, yeah, well, I'm prejudiced against these. He literally said that. He said, nothing like this happens. And I said, fine, that's your view. But I said, how come all the evidence, I talked to him for quite a while, and I said, how come all the evidence is on my side? You can't cite any data. Well, that's just my view. And I said, look, and here's where I have to leave them. People walked away from Jesus without ever coming to Jesus. Why do I think they're going to come to me? What I mean is, hey, wait a minute. Have you considered this? Have you considered that? Right. If we were good friends, we might ask for another coffee and another coffee. But I can't be upset when people walk away. They walked away from Jesus. Anybody, by the way, the most common question I get is, well, if it's as good as you think, how come people aren't being converted because of this? Well, let me just tell you something. If I introduced you to the sharpest, best-looking woman and you're single, and I said she's the best for you, and you agreed, and I said, can I be your best man? And you said, dude, I'm not getting married. I'm not getting married at all. That's your choice. That doesn't count. That's not evidence. It doesn't count against Jesus because you don't feel like getting married.
Yeah, so that feeling of getting married, that ultimately it comes down, it seems, to the will, what people want to do.
Very, very much happened to him. In fact, he called the Pharisees a wicked, adulterous generation, not because seeking a sign was evil, but because it wouldn't make a bit of difference to them. So.
Yeah, Gary, great. Okay. Thank you so much for the interview, and that's been this week's episode for Veracity Hill. We look forward to seeing you next week back in our studio office in downtown West Chicago. Thanks so much.